Early results declared him triumphant hours before the polls even closed. And now Vladimir Putin could stay in power for another 2 decades, but is resetting the clock on term limits, overstretching the limits of presidential power. I'm Ali Aslan, and today's newsmaker is Russia's constitutional referendum. The outcome of Wednesday's vote, the largest constitutional overhaul since the end of the Soviet Union, never seemed in doubt, so much so that Moscow bookshops are already stacked with copies of the amended constitution. But that didn't stop officials from offering prizes for voting, like gift vouchers and washing machines. Holding a nationwide referendum during a pandemic might not seem politically prudent, especially when the amendments were already approved by parliaments months ago. So, was this plebiscite a way of making those changes more legitimate? And in doing so, is Putin playing Russian roulette with the will of the people? Adam Pletz reports.
Russia has voted to amend its 1993 constitution with a landslide majority of 78%. The referendum paves the way for Vladimir Putin to remain president until the year 2036 by resetting the clock on his term limits. The 67-year-old has already been in power, either as president or prime minister, for 20 years. Critics say the referendum amounts to a constitutional coup, with the sole purpose of extending the president's power, a measure they say was buried in other amendments. In pre-referendum speeches, Putin certainly didn't draw attention to the possible extension of his presidency.
Мы голосуем за страну, в которой хотим жить, с современным образованием и здравоохранением, с надежной социальной защитой граждан, с эффективной властью, подотчетной обществу. Мы голосуем за страну, ради которой работаем, и хотим передать нашим детям и внукам.
Most of the campaign advertising also avoided mentioning the political reforms, instead emphasizing family values, faith in the Orthodox Church, and cultural heritage. Other changes include enshrining in the constitution boosts to the minimum wage and pension payments, as well as defining marriage as only between a man and a woman. The referendum was not legally required, as the amendments had already been passed by both houses of the Russian parliament and the Constitutional Court. But the government still used all means possible to encourage voter turnout, which the Election Commission says was at 65%.
I am against these amendments, and they are trying to push them by all means. At my work, they are forcing people to vote, regardless for or against, but to ensure voters turn out. The propaganda machine is working at full power, and I am against it, so I came here to vote.
Russia's only independent election monitoring group, Golos, has described the vote as the least transparent in years. It also says that holding the referendum during the COVID-19 pandemic prevented organized opposition, as public gatherings were not permitted. But Putin's supporters view the ballot as an endorsement of the president. According to pollster Levada, his approval ratings are at a healthy 60%, but far down from an all-time high of 90%. In choosing to adopt a new constitution, have millions of Russians effectively ensured a further 16 years of Putin's rule? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Moscow is Alexey Mukhin. He's the Director General of Russia's Center for Political Information. In London, we have Nikolai Petrov, a Senior Research Fellow with the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. And in Brussels is political analyst and former chairman of the Russian Booker Prize, Gilbert Doctorow. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us. Alexey, this referendum now enables President Putin to run for 2 more 6-year terms and potentially stay in power until 2036. He won the vote, this referendum, with an approval of 78%, but opposition politicians and election observers are calling this referendum illegitimate and illegal. Was this just a symbolic referendum with a foregone conclusion?
Okay, so it was expectable that opponents of Putin personally they want to put this point, I mean, the possibility for Putin to going for the next electoral campaign, and they try to concentrate on this attention of all Russian society. So they failed because the campaign that they organized was very aggressive. And I do think that people just afraid of this aggressiveness. And in the end, during the 7 days, people voting, and so change was adopted by Russian society. I don't think that process was not clean, because it was huge of watchers looking for all process about this. And in the end, we have this result. Okay, we can speak about 10, maybe 20% of not correct voting, but still Putin's won, and he confirmed his influence in Russian society. I do think that Putin did many things for this, because last half a year, he lost his political rating. Yes, it's a fact. It's a medical fact. But in the end of this campaign, he was the winner, and nobody can steal this winning from him now.
Nikolai, Alexey thinks and says this was a fair referendum. He won it fair and square. This was part of the democratic process in Russia. Would you concur? Was this part of the democratic process, or was this a predetermined outcome?
No, it was not part of the democratic process for sure. And there are at least two basic reasons to say this. One is that Russian constitution, as it existed before yesterday, did not allow for any kind of changes except for constitutional referendum. Those smallest amendments voted approved by the parliament, or adoption of the new constitution. What has happened was violation of the existing constitution, first of all. Second, when we say referendum, we should have in mind that it wasn't referendum as the one defined by Russian laws, with all restrictions. It was requirements, first of all. It was a kind of popular voting, as it has been called, with a lot of violations of different electoral procedures, including absence of observation, except for those observers sent by local authorities. That's why we can speak about how this voting took place, whether its results are valid or not, but it was illegal from the very beginning till the very end.
So Gilbert, we have two very different point of views here. Obviously, Alexey saying this was a clean and fair vote, Nikolai saying quite on the contrary, this has been rigged from the get-go. Where do you fall into place?
In between. It was a fair vote, in my estimation. I don't believe there were great irregularities. The Russian technical preparation of the voting, of the polling booths is such that it's very difficult today to have fraud. What you do have is old-fashioned vote buying. There's no question but that the president used those several weeks in the run-up to this election to be on the airwaves every day and to give allocations of aid to the parents of small children, to the parents of adolescents, to other fragile members of society. In other words, to enact the principles of the constitutional amendments at present, and to remind people of all the benefits they get from the regime that he heads. But I don't think that Mr. Putin was the winner of this referendum. I think he was the loser, because holding this referendum, and particularly with the Tereshkov amendment and rolling back his time in office, is a proof that he does not have a succession. And that is very sad. It's sad for Mr. Putin. It's sad for Russia.
But do you think that's something that President Putin cares about, to have a successor at this particular point?
At this particular point, perhaps not. But at 4 years from now, let's remember that we speak about Mr. Putin needing this amendment so that he wouldn't be a lame duck. I'm sorry, a lame duck is not a man in office 4 years before his time ends. 4 years is the normal term of an American president. And the same notion would be that you've just been elected, you've just been inaugurated, and you're a lame duck. That's not how politics works. I think it's entourage. I think it is the leaders of United Russia, it's people like Mr. Volodin, the Speaker of the Duma. They have imposed on Mr. Putin a possible stay in office to 2036 for their benefit, not for his benefit. And his benefit is badly served by not having the chance to promote people around him to succeed him in 4 years' time.
Alexey, Gilbert saying President Putin has been ill-served, perhaps even ill-advised by holding this referendum, which begs the question, what's the end game? What was the end game? What was the main intention of this referendum in the first place?
Yes. For instance, Nikolai Petrov is completely right about this was not referendum. This was plebiscite, because all things already happened before. All laws was not broken and everything was completely legal. But President Putin, in accordance with the Constitutional Court, decided that people should say their words. So it was addressed from Putin to people, normal people, to vote and to say yes or no to the changes that we have as a constitutional norms. So what's the truth with this situation around Putin, etc.? So I don't think that my colleague from Brussels is he's right, that this is a tactical step to go out of the form of lame duck, because now situation in the political system very stabilized completely. Before it was features of turbulence, and especially after self-isolation during the COVID pandemic retreatment. So, and now it's completely stable. Now we can going for changing in political system. It's a big job during the several months, maybe half of a year, and that's why we don't think that we have no perspective to re-elect State Duma or before the time we re-elect a president, like they said. So now the political system is stable, and we can develop step by step.
Nikolai, would you concur with your four speakers that this, in essence, even though on paper and on the surface it looks like a victory for President Putin, may turn out to be not so much a defeat, but certainly a sign of weakness?
Well, I think in general, Mr. Putin did manage to get much wider room for maneuver. But in my view, he is much weaker now than he used to be half a year ago when starting this game. That's why I think that although the political reform as such is still ahead, and Mr. Putin, due to all these amendments, is capable to do whatever he wants, in principle, I think his abilities are pretty much limited by the fact that he is much weaker now than he used to be, both in eyes of elites and in eyes of ordinary Russians. Although figures are looking pretty good, the very fact that the voting was going on for a week with a lot of different tricks, including electronic voting in Moscow and Nizhny Novgorod, which wasn't controlled almost at all, did mean that no more Putin was capable to get results needed without using these extraordinary things.
And Gilbert, of course, one begs also the question, why even have a referendum? At the end of the day, both the State Duma and the highest court of the nation had already approved this move. Why did President Putin call for this referendum and get the public involved?
Well, he wanted to show that a majority of the population backs him, and he wanted that majority to exist. When you take part in a referendum or in a plebiscite, you are personally committed to what you have put down on paper, and you become complicit with the sponsors of that move. So this is an old story. That's why you have plebiscites. But I'd like to just bring up one issue. Elections are about numbers. And we haven't spoken about numbers other than the simple fact of 78% versus 22%. I would point out that you can't draw any conclusions about this referendum until we have all the regional numbers. The amazing thing to me is that now, more than a day, in the second day, we find, well, the day after the elections, we do not have figures for St. Petersburg and Moscow. At least that was the case about an hour ago. We have figures for many other regional centers around Russia. They themselves show up some interesting facts, though minor. The Far East, Magadan, and Kamchatka were the areas with the most rejection of the referendum, on the order of 35, 36% no votes. On the other hand, you've got Chechnya, which had a 98% yes vote. Now, that of course is incredible and damaging to the cause of such a referendum. However, we don't know what happened in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and I would suspect there's a reason why that information has been withheld. I would suspect that the numbers are not nearly so attractive as 78, 22%.
Well, maybe Alexey has the answer for that. Why aren't these numbers being published?
Yes, of course, because the process of voting was very long, during 7 days. And the first 6 days, including electronic voting, they just keep voices. And only in the last day, they start to count and start to put it inside of the system. During all this period, it was under control, video control, and in safes, So it was very, very safe procedure, including electronic voting, because it was blockchain system. And one of the key was in a very high, huge opponent of present power, Grigory Melkonyan's from movement Golos. So you can't say that he's for Putin. He's completely opposite. And one of the key was in his hands. So it was really a fair game. So no, it's just, you should just understand what happened there. And we have a huge of voters. And in case of something wrong, I don't think that opposition can go in courts and say no, it's possible, impossible, etc.
Gilbert, does this explanation satisfy you?
Not really.
Sorry?
I don't. It could apply equally well to the counting in Chelyabinsk or in any of the dozen cities which were mentioned with specific returns by Yandex. So, and indeed, a place like Moscow or St. Petersburg, they should have been among the most efficient in turning out results. Let's look at the global result is just over 50% of the eligible voters having approved this, just barely squeaking by. That is 65% turnout times 78% approval. I am certain that in areas like the capitals, the results were quite different. Now, I'd like to just take the 20%. What does that stand for? It's very significant. 20% is about the strength of the Communist Party in the Russian electorate. The Communist Party were the only party that had the guts, the civic courage to say no to this referendum. Zyuganov was given the microphone about 2 weeks ago to comment on the referendum, and he said that this would leave Mr. Putin with more power than the pharaohs. That was a remarkably courageous statement to make. And I think that the 20% that we see voting against this referendum, I'm sure a large part of that were the followers of Mr. Zyuganov.
Nikolai, all numbers and figures aside, as disputed as they may be, let's look ahead. What does this referendum and the outcome now mean for President Putin and, more importantly, for the future of Russia?
I think that this referendum marks the end of the first constitutional phase of the political transformation. And now, as Alexey did rightly tell, Putin and the Kremlin should start the political reform. And the problem I see is connected with the fact that due to amending the constitution and due to the fact that some institutions looked not that well during the whole campaign, like, say, Central Election Commission, well, we do no more have any kind of more or less strong political institutions, which makes political transformation easier from one side. But it's needed now for the Kremlin to establish new or to strengthen existing institutions, because it will be the essence of political transformation. And I'm afraid they are hardly capable to do this now in result of how the changes in the constitution were taking place.
Gilbert, what's your take about the future of Russia and what this referendum means for the standing of the country?
I think it's a step backwards from where the whole process began, when just after the new year, Mr. Putin made his address to the bicameral legislature, and he introduced the whole notion of a constitutional set of amendments. He presented it first and foremost as a move towards greater parliamentarism and greater sharing of powers and rebalancing powers between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. The end result of the process is nothing of the sort, or if there's a redistribution, it is not in favor of the two other sources of government. It is in favor of the executive. And therefore, the possibility of Mr. Putin assuring a competent successor who has less responsibility than he has, and someone who could fill smaller shoes, that possibility has been put aside, very sadly. I think we can see a power struggle coming in the time when Mr. Putin is ready to leave office.
Alexey, who has emerged stronger from this referendum, Vladimir Putin or Russia?
Yes, of course. According to Putin, Putin confirmed his influence. Now he has a free hand to make this reforming already starting, social and political. We are already inside of this process. But at the same time, population got the very big preferences, because inside of the changes is a very huge and correct social complex that will make constitution as an instrument in the hand of civil society according to government. Government have no possibility to maneuver and to postpone these social initiatives. Now society can insist on fulfilling these changes. And I think it's a very nice movement to the democracy.
Nikolai, how likely is it that we will see a President Putin in Russia until at least 2036?
I don't think that's the major problem. And in my view, what was in Putin's mind when offering this amendment, which allow him to stay for additional 2 terms, was, and he did explicitly say this, was the idea not to look as a lame duck and to avoid any kind of turbulence within elites. What is important, I think, with regard to these changes, it's the fact that who should decide whether Putin will stay in office or not. Now it will be him, not Russian citizens, who will decide who should be the next president. And that's the problem. So by doing this, Putin took out of the society any power to decide who should lead the country. And he did get this power, and now it's in his hands.
Gilbert, final forecast for Russia and Vladimir Putin before we wrap it up.
Man proposes and God disposes. To say that Mr. Putin will stay in power until 2036 assumes that he will be healthy, assumes that everything will go his way. He will not become feeble-minded or disabled the way his predecessors who were kept in power by their entourages were. Mr. Brezhnev was half alive for the last several years of his head of state of the USSR. It's precisely to avoid that Putin said on the road that he had no intention of staying in office past 2024. We'll see whether he keeps to his original notion of having a strong and vital president versus an enfeebled and overaged president, or whether he succumbs to the pressures and wishes of his entourage.
And we will, of course, continue to follow the story as it unfolds. Alexey Mukhin, Nikolai Petrov, and Gilbert Doctorow, thank you so much for the information and insights you have provided on this referendum in Russia. And thank you, of course, out there for watching us as well, and hope to see you again next time for a new edition of Newsmakers. Thanks for watching.